the grandson of Queen Victoria, a shell marriage orchestrated by Buckingham Palace, and a same-sex love forced to be buried beneath the surface of early 20th century England. Alexander Mountbatten was not just a model military aristocrat. He was at the heart of a power-covering operation. This is a true account of how the royal machinery manipulated, coerced, and attempted to erase the true identities of its own members to protect the survival of the throne. Beyond the official court circulars, the private archives and diaries of figures like Cecil Beaton reveal a sharply different reality. This narrative dismantles the sanitized history of the first Marquess of Carisbrooke, examining how his position as Victoria's grandson made him both powerful and highly vulnerable. It traces his hidden life in London's underground, the strategic marriage engineered by Queen Mary, and the defiant message he left behind in his final will. He was born into an era where his very identity was a severe criminal offense. He was born Prince Alexander Albert of Battenberg on November 23, 1886, quite literally inside the imposing stone walls of Windsor Castle. His mother was Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's youngest and arguably most controlled daughter, a woman whose life was entirely subsumed by the needs of the aging monarch. His father was Prince Henry of Battenberg. Within the intimate circles of the royal family, the young prince was known simply as Drino. He was the golden boy of a gilded age, a living symbol of the sprawling, interconnected royal families of Europe. His early years were defined by the rigid protocols of the court. He attended Wellington College, an institution designed to mold the sons of the elite into pillars of the empire. He subsequently joined the Britannia Royal Naval College, following the traditional path expected of a male royal. He stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by the physical manifestations of imperial power. He was woven into the establishment. He had the exact pedigree, the uniform, and the unquestioned access that defined the ruling class. Yet, underneath the heavy wool of his naval uniforms, Alexander harbored a truth the crown could never accommodate. He was attracted to men. He came of age during the legal and social terror following the Labouchere Amendment of 1885, the exact legislation that criminalized all sexual acts between men, famously leading to the imprisonment and hard labor of Oscar Wilde just a decade after Alexander's birth. The British monarchy and the upper echelons of society were still deeply scarred and paranoid following the Cleveland Street Scandal of 1889. That event, which exposed a homosexual brothel frequented by aristocrats and individuals perilously close to the royal household, demonstrated that the public and the press would show no mercy. The mere whisper of a royal family member being involved in what the law termed gross indecency was considered an existential threat to the monarchy itself. The institution would not tolerate it, and the government would certainly not protect it. Faced with this terrifying reality, Alexander constructed a bifurcated existence. By day, he played his part flawlessly. He was the dutiful royal, serving in the Royal Navy, associating with the exclusive Castaways Club for naval officers, and eventually transferring to the prestigious Grenadier Guards. He attended the state banquets, the military parades, and the family gatherings with the requisite stoicism. He was, to the public eye, exactly what a grandson of Victoria should be. But as the sun set over London, the prince slipped into a completely different ecosystem. The homosexual underground of the capital was a tight-knit, highly secretive network of artists, minor aristocrats, working-class men, and social outcasts. It was a world built on absolute discretion, coded language, and immense ever-present risk. To enter this world was to risk imprisonment, blackmail, and total social annihilation. Yet it was only in these dimly lit clubs, private bohemian gatherings, and hidden corners of the city that Alexander could shed the crushing weight of his identity. Here, he was not the queen's grandson. He was simply a man seeking the connection and authenticity denied to him above ground. His forays into this world were initially careful, driven by a mixture of deep desire and profound fear. He learned the survival tactics of the underground, how to identify sympathetic peers, how to avoid the gaze of the police, and how to compartmentalize his mind so thoroughly that the naval officer of the morning had no visible connection to the man exploring the city's illicit nightlife. This psychological division took a toll. He was surrounded by sycophants and courtiers in his public life, yet deeply isolated in his private truth. The stakes were impossibly high. If he made a single mistake, trusted the wrong person, or was caught in a police raid, he would not only destroy his own life, but bring catastrophic shame upon his cousins, King Edward VII, and later King George V. He was living on a knife edge, balancing the unyielding demands of his bloodline against the undeniable reality of his own human nature. As he moved through his 20s, the pressure to conform grew heavier. The public expected a royal marriage, an extension of the lineage, and a public display of traditional domesticity. But Alexander's attachments remained firmly rooted in the hidden world he frequented. He observed other men of his class navigate similar paths, some opting for celibacy, others for quiet, discreet arrangements. Alexander, however, was drawing closer to the center of a bohemian circle that was increasingly reckless in its defiance of societal norms. It was within this specific, dangerous intersection of elite society and criminalized desire that he would eventually meet the man who would define the rest of his life, a man who possessed no royal titles, but commanded entirely the heart of the prince. The foundation for a monumental clash between personal truth and institutional survival had been laid. The royal family, obsessively monitoring its own, would soon detect the cracks in his facade. The era of his relatively unchecked, albeit terrifying, freedom in the underground was drawing to a close, about to be replaced by a cage constructed by the highest authorities in the land. But while Alexander and Simon were building their hidden sanctuary, the world above them was catching fire. The year was 1917, and the British Empire was locked in the catastrophic meat grinder of the First World War. The political climate in London was toxic, dominated by a virulent anti-German sentiment that viewed anything with a Germanic cadence as a threat to national security. The royal family, sitting atop the social hierarchy, was acutely vulnerable. King George V, Alexander's first cousin, looked across Europe and saw the Russian Romanovs, his own blood relatives, being overthrown and ultimately executed. The British monarchy realized that survival required a ruthless, immediate rebranding. In a sweeping stroke of public relations survivalism, the king ordered his family to abandon all German titles and names. The Saxe-Coburg-Gothas became the Windsors. The Battenbergs were anglicized to the Mountbattens. In this brutal restructuring, Alexander lost his status as a Prince of Battenberg. To compensate for the demotion, he was created the first Marquess of Carisbrooke. But the change in title did not erase the growing paranoia within the walls of Buckingham Palace. The royal family was now operating in a state of hypervigilance. Any scandal, any hint of moral failing could be weaponized by a public already traumatized by war and skeptical of the elite. It was precisely at this moment of maximum institutional vulnerability that whispers of Alexander's illicit late-night excursions began to reach the highest, most dangerous ears in the realm. The intelligence reached Queen Mary, the wife of King George V, and the undisputed iron-willed matriarch of the royal family. Queen Mary was not a woman who operated on sentimentality or familial warmth. She was a pragmatist obsessed with the preservation of the monarchy. She understood that a scandal involving the king's cousin and a homosexual art collector would not just be an embarrassment. In the volatile climate of 1917, it could be the spark that ignited a Republican movement. The threat had to be neutralized immediately, and Queen Mary deployed the oldest, most effective weapon in the royal arsenal, a strategically engineered marriage. The palace fixers did not need a love match. They needed a shield. They required a woman of unimpeachable social standing, possessing immense wealth, who could project an image of traditional, unyielding respectability. They found the perfect candidate in Lady Irene Denison. She was the daughter of the second Earl of Londesborough, a woman whose bank accounts were as vast as her independence. Lady Irene was not a naive, easily manipulated victim in this arrangement. She was a shrewd, modern aristocrat who understood exactly what was being proposed. The arrangement was, in essence, a corporate merger. Alexander would receive the ultimate cover story, a wealthy, respectable wife to silence the rumors and satisfy the public. In return, Lady Irene would marry into the immediate royal family, securing a level of access, prestige, and social dominance that even her vast fortune could not buy outright. The machinery of the state moved with terrifying efficiency. In July 1917, under the intense, watchful gaze of the royal family, Alexander married Lady Irene Denison. The press heralded the union as a triumph, a beautiful alliance between a dashing military man and a brilliant heiress. Yet behind the public spectacle, this marriage was essentially a corporate merger masquerading as a sacrament, a formidable barricade erected by Buckingham Palace to keep journalists and the law away from his private life. The immediate aftermath of the royal wedding of 1917 was a masterclass in public relations. The newspapers documented a blissful honeymoon and settled into the narrative of a modern, forward-thinking, aristocratic couple. But the reality behind the heavy mahogany doors of their residences was a highly structured, emotionally sterile transaction. Once the cameras were gone and the royal family retreated to their respective palaces, Alexander and Lady Irene faced the stark truth of their arrangement. They were two people bound not by affection, but by a mutual contract of preservation. Irene possessed an immense fortune inherited from her father, and she brought an unyielding shield of respectability to the union. Alexander provided the ultimate social currency, direct entry into the highest tier of the British royal family. It was a successful corporate merger masquerading as a sacrament. To solidify his new identity and further distance himself from any lingering suspicions regarding his private life, Alexander did something entirely unprecedented for a direct relative of the monarch. He went to work. Relinquishing the title of prince and now known as the Marquess of Carisbrooke, he entered the commercial sector. This was a calculated maneuver. A man heavily involved in corporate governance and daily office routines presents a moving target to the press and a picture of unassailable conventional masculinity to the public. He began his career as a clerk at Lazard Brothers, a prominent banking firm, applying the discipline he had learned in the military to the financial sector. He did not simply lend his name to letterheads. He worked his way up the corporate ladder, eventually securing a position as a director of Lever Brothers. This corporate life served a dual purpose. It provided him with an independent stream of income, reducing his reliance on the royal purse, but more importantly, it built a fortress around his daily schedule. The boardroom became another stage where he could perform the role of the dutiful, heterosexual aristocrat. He spent his days analyzing markets, negotiating contracts, and shaking hands with industry leaders. He was universally respected by his peers as a serious, hard-working peer of the realm. Yet, the profound isolation of this existence was staggering. He sat at the head of boardroom tables, a man wielding immense financial and social power, completely unable to speak a single true word about his own life to the men sitting next to him. Lady Irene, meanwhile, was not languishing in the shadows. The Marchioness of Carisbrooke utilized her newly acquired royal status and her vast personal wealth to carve out a formidable public presence. She was fiercely independent and held little interest in playing the role of a submissive society wife. She threw herself into philanthropic and social causes, notably becoming the first president of the Women's Automobile and Sports Association. She was a woman who commanded rooms, organized massive charitable events, and eventually earned the title of Dame Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire. She and Alexander operated on parallel tracks. They attended state banquets together, smiled for the society photographers at Ascot, and maintained a flawless united front whenever the eyes of the royal institution were upon them. The most critical clause of their unspoken contract was fulfilled in 1920 with the birth of their only child, Lady Iris Mountbatten. The arrival of an heir satisfied the biological requirement of the lineage and provided the final undeniable proof of their conventional marriage to the outside world. Once the duty of producing a child was accomplished, the physical reality of their marriage effectively ceased. They retreated into separate wings of their grand estates, living largely independent lives under the same roof. Irene was fully aware of her husband's true nature. She knew about the late nights, the discreet absences, and the men who occupied his actual affections. But she chose to look the other way. Her immense wealth financed their extravagant lifestyle, and by extension it financed the secure environment Alexander needed to maintain his private relationships. It was a cold compromise, but it was a compromise that allowed them both to survive the crushing expectations of their environment. With the marriage stabilized and the public completely deceived, Alexander carefully reconstructed his connection with Simon Fleet. The dynamic of their relationship had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer two men navigating the dangerous underground of their youth. They were now operating within the highly structured confines of an elite cover-up. Fleet had to accept a deeply painful reality. He was the center of Alexander's emotional world, Yet he was entirely invisible to the state, the public, and the royal family. He could not attend the dinners, he could not stand beside Alexander at public events, and he possessed no legal right to the man he loved. He was a ghost haunting the margins of the Carisbrooke estate. Their meetings required meticulous planning. They utilized a network of sympathetic friends within the upper-crust bohemian circles of London, people who understood the rules of discretion and were willing to provide safe houses and private dining rooms where the Marquess and his lover could exist without fear of exposure. The fragility of these moments was immense. In a society that demanded absolute conformity, their stolen weekends and quiet evenings behind locked doors were acts of quiet, desperate rebellion. Alexander was essentially holding his breath for decades. Every time he stepped out of a private townhouse and back into his chauffeured car to return to his wife, he had to reassemble the armor of his public persona. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the world around them shifted rapidly. The rigid Victorian and Edwardian moralities were beginning to crack under the weight of a modernizing society. But the institution of the British monarchy remained an impenetrable fortress of traditionalism. The pressure on Alexander never lessened. It merely evolved into a steady, grinding anxiety. He watched other members of the aristocracy occasionally falter, their private lives exposed by ruthless journalists or disgruntled associates, resulting in immediate social exile and sometimes imprisonment. The threat was not theoretical. It was a constant breathing entity in the room with them. When the Second World War erupted, Alexander, despite being in his mid-50s, once again put on a uniform. He joined the Royal Air Force, working diligently in intelligence. He was, as always, doing his duty for the crown. But the war years also brought a deepened reliance on the few genuine connections he possessed. The bombings of London and the sheer proximity to death stripped away many of the superficial concerns of society. Through the chaos and the destruction, his bond with Fleet remained the only constant, unvarnished truth in a life built entirely on strategic deception. They were aging now, the energetic prince and the youthful art collector, replaced by mature men who had spent their entire adult lives navigating a minefield. The facade was holding, but the psychological cost of maintaining it was quietly eroding the man behind the title. The aftermath of the Second World War left Britain fundamentally altered, but the rigid expectations placed upon the royal family remained largely frozen in time. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, Alexander Mountbatten found himself navigating a world that was rapidly modernizing, yet he remained tethered to the strict Victorian morality of his birth. He was no longer the dashing young naval officer, nor the energetic corporate director building a fortress of respectability. He was transitioning into the role of an elder statesman, a living artifact of a sprawling imperial past. The post-war era brought a profound shift in his daily existence. The sheer physical and emotional exhaustion of maintaining a dual identity for nearly half a century began to manifest. The relentless vigilance required to protect Simon Fleet from the public eye and to protect the crown from the reality of Simon Fleet had taken an irreversible toll on his spirit. In 1953, the architecture of his confinement underwent a seismic shift. Queen Mary, the imposing matriarch who had forcefully engineered his marriage and enforced the family's uncompromising moral code, passed away. Her death marked the end of an era for the Windsors and removed the primary enforcer of Alexander's lifelong masquerade. While her passing undoubtedly lifted a specific, deeply ingrained terror that had haunted his actions since 1917, the institutional machinery she had built remained firmly in place. The young Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne, and the absolute necessity of protecting the sovereign's image was as paramount as ever. Alexander was still a prisoner to his lineage. The original warden was simply gone, replaced by the self-sustaining momentum of royal tradition. 3 years later, in 1956, the final pillar of his public facade collapsed with the death of Lady Irene. The Marquess of Carisbrooke, the woman who had served as his highly effective, fiercely independent shield for nearly 40 years, left him a widower. Theirs had never been a romance, but it had been a profoundly significant and successful partnership. They had navigated a complex, emotionally barren arrangement with a remarkable degree of pragmatic success. Irene had provided the wealth, the required heir, and the unassailable cover story that kept the hounds at bay. With her gone, Alexander found himself alone in the cavernous rooms of Kensington Palace. The public saw a grieving husband, the last surviving grandson of Queen Victoria, mourning the loss of his lifelong companion. The reality was far more stark. The loss of Irene meant the loss of his primary defense mechanism against the prying eyes of the press and the state. Without his wife to anchor his public image and justify his domestic arrangements, Alexander's reliance on Simon Fleet became absolute. They were now two elderly men, bound together by a lifetime of shared secrets, societal defiance, and a quiet, enduring devotion. The frantic, adrenaline-fueled nights of their youth in the London Underground had long since faded, replaced by the hushed intimacy of private drawing rooms and discreet companionship. Simon was the only person alive who held the complete, unedited narrative of Alexander's life. He was the keeper of the memories the crown wanted desperately to pretend did not exist. Contemporary accounts from those within their trusted inner circle, most notably the observations carefully noted by society figures like Cecil Beaton, painted a picture of a deep, unquestionable bond between the two men. Fleet was no longer just a lover hidden in the shadows. He was Alexander's truest family. Yet the cruelty of their situation remained absolute. Even in his 70s, as an elderly widower living out his final years, Alexander could not publicly acknowledge the man who sat across from him. The laws of the land had not changed. Homosexuality was still a criminal offense in 1950s. Britain, and the social penalty for a royal outing, even for an aging marquis, would have been catastrophic to the institution. Fleet remained a ghost to the outside world. He could not accompany Alexander to official royal functions. He could not be named in the court circulars. And if Alexander fell ill, Fleet had no legal standing to make decisions or even sit openly by his bedside as family. The tragedy of their later years lay in this enforced, unbroken invisibility. They had survived a world war, the collapse of empires, and the ruthless internal politics of the royal family, but they could not survive the simple, mundane reality of being seen together in the daylight. As his health began to definitively fail in the late 1950s, Alexander was forced to confront his own mortality and the impending legacy he would leave behind. He looked at the vast accumulation of his life, the medals, the honorary military ranks, the aristocratic titles, and the corporate board positions. He knew exactly how the official biographers, the royal archivists, and the press would frame his existence. They would write the story of the first Marquess of Carisbrooke as a dutiful servant of the crown, a successful businessman who bridged the gap between royalty and commerce, and a loyal husband. The narrative was already written, waiting only for the final date to be filled in. His entire truth, his identity as a gay man, and his profound lifelong love for Simon Fleet were slated to be erased completely. He was going to be buried as a sanitized two-dimensional symbol of aristocratic virtue. This realization sparked a quiet, devastating rebellion within the aging Marquess. He had spent his entire adult life sacrificing his personal authenticity for the preservation of the Mountbatten and Windsor names. He had allowed himself to be used as a prop, marrying a woman he did not physically desire to protect cousins whose thrones demanded perfection. He had accepted the role assigned to him because he had been conditioned from birth to believe in the innate duty of his bloodline. But facing the end of his life, he recognized that accepting a role did not mean he had to accept total, silent erasure. He could not change the way he had been forced to live, but he realized with a sudden and sharp clarity that he possessed the power to permanently alter the official record of his death. He began to carefully consider his last will and testament. For a man of his station and wealth, a will is not merely a mundane distribution of assets. It is a final, highly scrutinized legal statement of priority, affection, and legacy, recorded permanently in the archives of the British state. The standard procedure, the path expected by the royal fixers, who monitored his every move, was straightforward. His considerable wealth, his properties, and his deeply personal effects should logically pass to his daughter, Lady Iris, or revert cleanly to the royal estate. It would provide the final neat conclusion to the public lie he had maintained since his wedding day in 1917. But Alexander recognized that the will offered him a unique, unprecedented opportunity. It was a legally binding document that the royal family could not simply ignore, shred, or easily rewrite once it was executed. It was a weapon of truth, and he decided to aim it directly at the heart of the institution that had demanded his lifelong silence. The preparation of this document would be his final definitive act, a calculated strike designed to detonate only after he was safely beyond the reach of their retribution. The process of drafting the will required absolute discretion and a level of strategic planning that Alexander had honed over decades of living a double life. He knew he could not rely on the standard royal attorneys or the firm that traditionally handled the affairs of the extended Windsor family. Those men reported ultimately to the Crown's private secretary and were bound by an ingrained loyalty to the institution before the individual. To ensure his final wishes were respected and not quietly sanitized by the palace fixers, Alexander had to secure independent legal counsel. He needed men bound strictly by attorney-client privilege, professionals who were immune to the immediate, crushing pressures of Buckingham Palace. In the quiet, lonely confines of his Kensington Palace apartments, as the winter of 1959 set in and his physical strength began to wane, the aging Marquess systematically laid out his final terms. He meticulously cataloged his estate. While the bulk of the trust and the publicly visible assets would follow the expected legally conventional routes to his daughter Lady Iris, Alexander carved out a highly specific, undeniable portion of his legacy for Simon Fleet. He did not leave this to chance. This was not a vague financial provision that the royal family could easily explain. Away to the press as a charitable donation to an old acquaintance or a minor staff member. Alexander deliberately selected items of profound personal significance, specific antiques, private collections, and personal effects that spoke directly to a shared domesticity and an intimate, lifelong bond. By listing these specific items and explicitly naming Fleet as the primary beneficiary of this personal collection, Alexander was doing something revolutionary. He was creating a legally binding historical document that the palace could not simply burn. He was cementing Simon Fleet's existence into the official legal records of the British state. On February 23, 1960, the physical toll of his long, deeply fractured existence finally reached its conclusion. Alexander Mountbatten suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage at Kensington Palace. He was 73 years old. Upon the pronouncement of his death, the immediate machinery of the British establishment engaged with well-practiced, chilling precision. Buckingham Palace issued the standard, somber bulletins mourning the loss of the Queen's cousin and the last surviving grandson of Queen Victoria. The national press, conditioned to respect the boundaries of royal reporting, fell into line instantly. The obituaries published in the Times, the Telegraph, and across the Commonwealth were extensive and thoroughly sanitized. They praised his pioneering transition into the commercial sector, his dignified military service in intelligence during the Second World War, and his steadfast, quiet loyalty to the crown. The journalists spoke warmly of his late wife, Lady Irene, painting a flawless portrait of a conventional, respectable widower who had lived a full, dutiful life. The royal public relations strategy was executing flawlessly. The funeral was arranged with the quiet, imposing dignity reserved for senior members of the extended royal family. His ashes were transported to the Isle of Wight, returning him to the Battenberg Chapel at St. Mildred's Church in Whippingham, the very heart of his family's historical territory. As the royal family gathered in their mourning dress to pay their respects, there was a palpable collective sigh of relief within the ranks of the senior courtiers. The first Marquess of Carisbrooke, a man whose private life had posed a constant, terrifying threat to the institution for over 40 years, was safely interred. With his death, his specific aristocratic title became extinct. There were no male heirs to carry the Carisbrooke name, and his only daughter, Lady Iris, was living an independent life across the Atlantic in the United States, far removed from the rigid expectations of London society. To the palace fixers, the Carisbrooke file was effectively closed. The secret, they believed, had been successfully contained and buried alongside him. This illusion of safety shattered entirely a few weeks later during the reading of his last will and testament. The gathering of lawyers and estate executors in London expected a routine, quiet distribution of wealth. Instead, they were handed a live legal grenade. As the document was read aloud, the carefully constructed facade of Alexander Mountbatten's life collapsed within the walls of that room. The explicit bequest to Simon Fleet left absolutely no room for ambiguity. The deliberate language of the will, detailing the transfer of cherished personal possessions to a well-known male figure in the London bohemian and homosexual underground, was an undeniable declaration of their relationship. It was a formal legal acknowledgement of the man the royal family had spent decades trying to erase from existence. The panic that erupted within the upper echelons of the royal household was immediate and absolute. A last will and testament is a public document, eventually accessible to journalists, historians, and the public. If the press got hold of the specifics, the ensuing scandal would not merely tarnish the memory of a deceased marquess. It would expose a systemic, decades-long hypocrisy. It would reveal that the crown had knowingly harbored, protected, and covered up the life of a royal who was engaged in a lifestyle that, at that exact time, was resulting in the police raids, arrests, and imprisonment of ordinary British citizens. The establishment had to move faster and hit harder than they ever had during Alexander's lifetime. A severe and highly coordinated effort was launched to suppress the contents of the will. Royal courtiers leveraged their immense unspoken influence over Fleet Street editors, establishing ironclad press embargoes. The narrative was violently wrestled back into conformity before it could even leak. Simon Fleet received his inheritance, the physical manifestations of the love he had shared with Alexander, but he received them under a suffocating blanket of enforced silence. He was legally and socially gagged by the sheer weight of the establishment. The public continued to be fed the lie of the respectable, lonely widower, completely blind to the fact that the Queen's cousin had just orchestrated a posthumous strike against the monarchy's demand for absolute moral conformity. This moment represented the ultimate painful contradiction of Alexander's life. He had lacked the power to live freely while he was breathing, restrained by the invisible chains of his titles and the terrifying legal landscape of early 20th century Britain. Yet in death, he wielded the very legal system that criminalized his existence to force a permanent acknowledgement of his truth. He used the unquestionable authority of a royal will to carve Simon Fleet's name into the history of the Mountbatten family. It was a tragic victory. He had secured Fleet's financial comfort and historical presence, but the cost was his own lifelong suffering and the bitter reality that they could never enjoy that acknowledgement together. For Simon Fleet, the aftermath was a quiet descent into obscurity. He had been the secret center of a royal's world, a man who possessed the heart of the Queen's cousin. But society dictated he be treated as an embarrassing administrative error to be swiftly silenced. The love story between Alexander and Simon was ultimately ground down by the relentless machinery of the state, leaving behind only the fragmented evidence found in private diaries and the stubborn, undeniable text of a suppressed legal document. To understand the sheer efficiency of this royal cover-up, one must look at the mechanics of the British state's archival system. The Royal Archives, housed within the Round Tower of Windsor Castle, operate under entirely different rules than standard public records. They are heavily restricted, exempt from the standard Freedom of Information Acts that govern other historical documents. The royal family exercises absolute control over what is released to historians and biographers, and more importantly, what remains sealed. Alexander's deeply personal correspondence, the internal palace memorandums regarding his behavior, and the frantic communications triggered by his will were swallowed by this institutional vault. The establishment did not just suppress a news story in 1960, they systematically sanitized the primary source materials for future generations. The official biographies were written using only the approved sterilized documents provided by the Crown. This level of crisis management was not an isolated incident. It was a core function of the Windsor machine. The monarchy survives not by being flawless, but by ruthlessly managing its flaws. The handling of the Carisbrooke affair provided the palace with a tested blueprint for neutralizing internal threats. The strategy was clear: isolate the individual, construct a respectable public facade, often through marriage, and utilize the symbiotic relationship with the British press to enforce a strict embargo on the truth. The system was designed to protect the sovereign at all costs. An uncle, a cousin, or a sibling is ultimately expendable if their private reality threatens the perceived moral authority of the monarch. Alexander was a collateral casualty of this institutional survival mechanism. He was granted a life of immense material privilege, but he paid for it with his fundamental right to authenticity. The bitter irony of Alexander's timeline is inescapable. He died in 1960, a man whose entire existence was shaped, restricted, and terrified by the Labouchere Amendment and the criminalization of homosexuality. Yet, just 7 years after his death, the British Parliament passed the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalized private homosexual acts between consenting adults over the age of 21 in England and Wales. The suffocating moral and legal architecture that forced him into a sham marriage with Lady Irene Dennison. The laws that made his relationship with Simon Fleet a jailable offense were dismantled. He had lived his entire 73 years in the dark, dying just before the dawn of a massive social and legal shift. He was a prisoner to a specific temporary era of British law. But the psychological damage inflicted by the royal family's enforcement of that law was permanent. This rigid enforcement becomes even more stark when contrasted with other figures within the extended royal circle who attempted to navigate the same dangerous waters. While Alexander chose the path of quiet submission and strategic cover-ups, others tested the limits of the establishment's patience. Prince George, Duke of Kent, a younger cousin within the royal family, lived a remarkably reckless life during the 1920s and 1930s. He was openly bisexual within elite circles, engaging in highly dangerous affairs with prominent figures, socializing in underground clubs, and actively drawing the attention of police and intelligence services. The palace fixers were constantly intervening to retrieve the Duke from compromised situations, paying off blackmailers and utilizing the secret intelligence service to retrieve incriminating letters. The Duke of Kent's approach was chaotic, directly threatening the crown with imminent public exposure. He did not possess Alexander's discipline or willingness to disappear entirely behind a corporate desk and a quiet country estate. Ultimately, Prince George died in a highly suspicious military plane crash in Scotland in 1942, an event that conveniently and permanently solved a massive public relations crisis for the royal household. The contrast between the two men highlights the brutal reality of the institution. Whether a royal chose loud defiance like the Duke of Kent, or decades of silent suffering, and a sham marriage like the Marquess of Carisbrooke, the establishment always won. The machine either silenced you in life or sanitized you in death. There was no scenario where a member of the royal bloodline was permitted to openly challenge the moral orthodoxy of the era and survive with their status and freedom intact. The legacy of Alexander Mountbatten is not found in the official court circulars or the military honors he accumulated. His true legacy is a profound critique of the institution he served. His life exposes the immense, often devastating gap between the public performance of royalty and the private reality of the human beings trapped within it. The public demands a fairy tale, a flawless display of duty, tradition, and conventional morality. To deliver that fairy tale, The establishment must often resort to cruelty, coercion, and the systematic erasure of anything that does not fit the narrative. Alexander was forced to be an actor in a play he did not write, reciting lines he did not believe, opposite a wife he did not desire. He played the part perfectly until the very end, leaving only a legally binding will as a final desperate proof that the man behind the costume actually existed. The story of the first Marquess of Carisbrooke remains one of the most successfully buried chapters in modern British royal history. Today his name is largely forgotten by the general public, a minor footnote in the sprawling genealogical charts of the House of Windsor. The Battenberg Chapel on the Isle of Wight is quiet, visited occasionally by tourists who read the brass plaques detailing his military service and his marriage to Lady Irene. There is no mention of Simon Fleet. There is no acknowledgement of the decades spent navigating the perilous underground of London. The official record stands exactly as the royal fixers intended in 1960, clean, respectable, and entirely false. Yet, the suppression of his story serves as a vital historical document in itself. It forces a re-examination of how history is constructed by those in power. It demands that we look past the televised weddings, the state funerals, and the carefully curated public relations campaigns of the elite, and recognize the human cost of maintaining such flawless illusions. Alexander Mountbatten was a man born to the highest pinnacle of global privilege, possessing wealth and access that ordinary citizens could barely comprehend. But that privilege was a gilded cage. He was a grandson of an empire, a decorated military officer, and a successful corporate director. Yet he was denied the single most basic human right, the right to simply be himself without fear of destruction. The royal machine successfully protected its image, but in doing so, it destroyed a man's truth. And that is a fact no amount of historical whitewashing can ever truly erase.